Rajendra Satish Peri, who unfortunately is not here. He's currently in Hyderabad getting a dialysis done under pandemic, but we'll have that discussion for another time. The idea of Reboot Fest was to talk about the changes that are coming for the current times. Some of these are not necessarily new ideas, like, for example, remote work. We've had remote work before this pandemic struck us. Remote work has become a necessity as a result of this pandemic. And of course, there will be questions about whether we continue this or not. There are ideas from the past that are becoming important for the present. There are ideas from the present that will become important for the future. And so Reboot Fest is essentially a festival to look at some of these ideas. At the moment, Reboot Fest itself is an idea, so we'll see how it kind of goes. And moving beyond ideas, let's talk about what we will be doing today. Funnily enough, when I was trying to conceptualize this event, I realized that running an event is like running a PhD thesis every time. It's like writing your PhD thesis, where you want to think about the focus, you want to think about what the audience will take away, what is it that the resource persons will take away. And so that's always a challenge, but it's also very exciting. And so therefore, what are we going to do in this event today? We have a very large agenda saying that is there a framework we can arrive regarding work from home? And this is an ongoing conversation. We don't expect to have all the answers today. But what will be useful is to kind of understand how some organizations have done it. And we also have a very interesting mix of attendees who probably have been remote workers themselves, who are organizations who are trying to hire for diversity, who are trying to solve for these problems. And we hope to bring them into this conversation and see what the expectations are, both from an employer perspective as well as from a candidate perspective, and what are the factors beyond employment, which is societal, that we have to consider. And having said that, it's a really large agenda, but we promise we will finish within an hour so you can get back to your Friday evening, if a Friday evening is different under a lockdown and what it was earlier. So without much ado, this is what we intend to do today. The format of this event is that there will be a bunch of questions that we will be asking Ashok, Shipra, and Rahul, who we will introduce in a short bit. There will be participants who will chip in to answer questions. We're also watching the questions that are coming on YouTube Live. If you're watching us from YouTube Live, we will incorporate your questions from YouTube Live also into the discussion. Some of you as attendees, we will unmute you so that you can ask questions in between. And some of you may have to ask your questions in the Q&A tab or raise your hand so that we can unmute you. We have a few polls that we will also run during the event. So let's see how we can make it interactive and a fun one for the Friday evening. So with that, what I'd like to do is to ask each one of you to introduce yourself. Let's go in an alphabetical order. So Ashok, if you can introduce yourself and your organization a brief bit for about a minute or two, and then we go with Rahul and Shipra.
Hi, my name is Ashok Hariharan, and I have a company called Bungeni Consulting, which operates in the legal tech space. So it's a very niche space dealing with legislation and technology. And my company has been operating on a work from home basis right from the beginning. Our clients are they're all overseas, they're all remote. All the people who work and worked for me, they've all been remote. I myself am remote. So that has been my overall experience. So I've also worked as a remote consultant. So it kind of made sense for me to keep everything remote. So that's where I'm coming from.
Rahul?
Hi, my name is Rahul Gonzalez. I run a design firm called Obvious. We've been around for about 8 years now. And well, thank you for having us here, for starters, Zainab, Hasgeek, and the rest of the attendees. We've been around for about 8 years, like I said, and we started out pretty much at the same time that mobile started to be a thing in India, and have moved from building out the first apps for companies like Flipkart, Myntra, Swiggy, Dunzo, and then have continued to be part of their growth stories and many other companies like theirs since then. I essentially, I'm one of the 3 founders. I take care of setting organizational priorities, and I'm a combination of a CEO/janitor. One of the things that I look at very closely is the hiring aspects. In a previous life, I looked at a lot of issues around accessibility in India, specifically electronic accessibility. And while that doesn't have a direct correlation with today's panel, I think a lot of the principles that we dealt with and talked about at that point in time have significant overlaps with the way that we look at hiring at Obvious.
Thanks, Rahul. Shipra?
Hi guys, I'm Shipra Pandit. I'm working with JustPay. It's a digital payment solution platform, and I'm heading the HR department at JustPay. So let's say from the last 5 years, I'm working for JustPay and doing a lot of hiring and working in different domains of human resources for them. And diversity has been one of the part. I'm very excited to be here today and to talk about it. Thank you.
Thanks, Shipra. I would just take a minute to say that we have about 10 attendees here on Zoom, some of who I know and some of whom we will include and add you to kind of ask questions in between. So give us about 10 minutes to set this conversation rolling, and we will add you in. In the meantime, if you have questions, please put them on the Q&A tab. And those who are watching us from YouTube, please put your questions in the chat link. We will pull your questions from there into this discussion. Okay, so let's start over here, and what we have here to set the context once again, that we have two representations over here: Ashok, who has run a remote company, and Rahul and Shipra, who don't necessarily have a remote company, but they have tried to solve for diversity. We will see how we can get both these conversations going into each other and also meet participant expectations here. Ashok, maybe we'll start with you first, where there are a few specific questions that I had. The first one being is that when you were hiring for Bunjani, and you might want to just reset the context for Bunjani, what was your messaging, and what was it about remote work that you found that was appealing to candidates when you went about hiring, and how did you find that pool of people in terms of who were interested in remote work, and what were their concerns?
Well, I started in the normal way, like, you have these sites like, you yourself, your organization has a site, Hasjob and Angel List, and, these job portals. So I essentially advertised on these portals, and I had a broad sweep of people applying there. So the formula is, I didn't know a formula because it was something new for me to start with. So initially, I was looking at the credentials and I was hiring on the basis of credentials. So just to be honest, I never did this with any idea of diversity or anything in mind, So I was just looking at getting things done, finding the right people for that, at the most economical cost. And that is what motivated me. But I ended up on the other side because I ended up hiring the classical formula, you get a guy from IIT, you hire him, you get two people from IIT, you hire him, but it didn't really work for me because working from home was not compatible with some of these people. They had different expectations. They had been in large organizations, they had been to offices, so they had very different expectations, so they were new to it, and it didn't work out initially. I hired people from these organizations, and I had to fire them, or they quit after 2 months because they could not understand what it means to work from home, and they were not, some people were not honest to start with. Then by accident, I realized that there were quite a few women applying, and there were at least, there were people with other constraints, like, some kind of disability, who were applying. And I had actually rejected somebody in an interview because they had a speech disability. So, then it struck me that, maybe there's, because that person actually wrote back to me saying, maybe I didn't do well in the interview because I spoke badly, but I have a speech problem. So what do I do? So then I got in touch with that guy's referees, and they all told me, hey, he's fine. He just has a bit of a speech impediment, but he's fine. So I ended up hiring this guy. I hired another lady who told me she can't do full time, but she's willing to do a few hours a day because she's trying to learn the violin at home. So she wouldn't tell me the reason in the beginning. Then finally she told me, I'm trying to learn the violin, and the teacher comes home, so that is the only way. And she was in Mumbai. She was in Mumbai, and she could not commute. I said, fine, I'll take you on board. And so similarly, I had other cases of ladies who were stuck at home because they had kids and the husband was working late hours, and they did not have the flexibility of commuting and coming back home and cooking. I don't know, all the typical things that housewives do. So I ended up hiring, a diverse set of people like that. So it was purely by accident, And honestly, it worked out because I found that all these people who had all these constraints of their own, they were more diligent, They paid a lot more attention to their time when they worked from home. So, for example, the lady who was doing part-time, 4 hours, she was able to do what the other people were able to do in 8 hours. The I call normal people, young people, who would love to work in some startup company or somewhere. She was doing more work in 4 hours than what those people were doing. So, just to give you an example, and it was not the only case, even the other cases, there were people who were more communicative, and because they were in those circumstances and they had no other choice. So they kind of forced themselves to adapt to the circumstances. They had adapted a room in their house just to be able to work from home, things like that, So they had the facilities and they had thought of it. So it was not just, let me just try this out. They had actually thought about it, and they had set up their lives to be able to do this efficiently. So that was basically my experience.
Thanks, Ashok. And I think you did make a point which you might want to push, which is regarding your own perspective on work from home. So if you can push that point, and then we will move to Shipra and Rahul.
Okay, so you mean in terms of
context and how work from home enables you to create your own context and
okay.
work.
So, I have a broader perspective on this. Some people think I'm crazy when I say it. But I think, if you look at humanity itself, this whole going to the office and doing things together, and, it's all a new concept. It's only 100 years old, since 1906 or whatever. Taylorism, it all came out of there. Humans are not designed to work like machines, like cogs in a machine. So my belief is that, right now with the internet and a lot of the work that is non-industrial, like the way, like the work that the tech space is doing, it is very well adapted to people, doing things from home, in their own social context. So, I find it very strange when I see companies saying, you come to office, let's build an office community, you make friends. They have to say that because people spend 12 hours at the office. They do 2 hours of commutes. They are spending 10 hours there. So it's nonsense. My community is my neighbor. So I know people who go to office, spend 12 hours a day. They don't even know their neighbor. So what is the point of work like that? So with work from home, you don't need that office community. The first feedback I get from HR people and people in offices, oh my God, I miss the office. I miss the camaraderie at the office. I'm saying, why do you need that? If you're working from home, you got your people around you. You have time to make friends around you. You don't even have to live in the city. You don't have to live in Bangalore. You can live anywhere you want in your own friendly, green social context, as long as you got a good internet, which is there in most places, very many places in India. I don't see what the problem is. It didn't need a pandemic for us to think about this.
Okay, thanks, Ashok. We'll come back to this point. I'm going to move to Shipra and then Rahul. I think both Shipra and Rahul, since we are moving to the diversity context, what I'd like to understand from both of you is tell us a little bit about your business. And I know Rahul's already done that. And tell us, why did you decide to kind of hire more women for your work? What has been your approach and your messaging when you reach out to candidates asking them to join you, specifically with respect to women? And do you have a sense of the expectations that women have from workplaces, from employers, in terms of the messaging, as well as when you actually had candidates join you? So Shipra, if you can go first.
Surely. So I wanted to start from the very beginning. Let's say in earlier times, the hiring were related to mostly the compliance related goals. However, the latest trend of inclusive hiring is related to be more collaborative and team based structure. So the collaboration doesn't need you to be, sitting in person and talking about it. So at Just Pay, we offered a very flexible flexibility as the workplace perk, and we brought this win-win strategy by being sensitive to the needs of the people, and then providing them options to accommodate the varied set of work. Now I believe the organizations that wake up to this they establish a very common vision, and they achieve high goals by both supporting and capitalizing a diverse workforce, and they succeed, right? So JustPay is working on a very niche programming language. We are working on functional programming. We are working on Haskell and PureScript, and it's it's been known to very less number of people. It's There are very scarce resources in all over the world to this technology. So we don't look for people with skill knowledge. We don't look for people with the domain understanding. We look for people who has the ability to learn and code, and also have the curiosity to dig deep. So that's how we are engaging more people remotely. And here we have brought in a lot of women's. We have you know brought in the ability to solve the problems, and we have seen that women's are more disciplined when it comes to work, when it comes to getting the work done. They are more into it. So maybe the innovation uh, or the creativity might be bit on the other side of the areas, like design and more creative ideas towards building into some processes and all. But the discipline part is the only thing where I feel that women has done their part really well, and they have excelled and achieved the goals of the organization. And therefore we are focusing more on different set of people and the gender itself.
Okay. Rahul, if you can, and also if you can specifically and concretely point to us, how do you message when you specifically reach out to women candidates? What have you learned in terms of their expectations, in terms of what they expect of the workplace and of the employer when you have put out your hiring messages?
Sure. So I'll in the same way that Shipra did, I'll step back for a second and talk to you a little bit about our motivations for building a more representative workplace. Right. I think that one of our main reasons for doing so was that we're in the business of building products for other people. And we believe that a product which has been built by a homogeneous set of people is unlikely to take into account the opportunities or challenges that a diverse world faces. So we didn't set out to say, hey, we want to hire more women, right? I think that's very key to sort of understand. We said, how do we build a workplace that is better representative of the world in which we exist, right? So that's the broad idea that we had. And of course, gender is possibly the first, and perhaps on the scale of different axes of diversity, perhaps the easiest to tackle in the beginning, right? Or perhaps that's me speaking from having gone through that process for about 3 years now, right? I think when you start interrogating different kinds of axes, when you go into like we were talking about earlier, when we go into axes around sexuality, around disability, around caste, around class, etc., it becomes far more complex to figure out exactly how to calibrate one's hiring, sort of pipeline processes. I think the other thing that you talked about, right? How do we actually reach out? It actually starts far before that, right? So we set out 3 years ago to say, hey, we're not, at that point in time, we were a very, and I think that we're baby steps along that particular journey. But we have a far less representative organization than we are today. So we set out to say, okay, how do we actually look at our overall organization's growth going forward? And I think a key part of that was to look at every part of our workplace, right? So there's one part of it is, of course, when you actively reach out to people. But even before that, how do you build, I think today it's called an employee brand, right? How do you build an idea around, an idea with people who may not actively be looking to join your workplace? You may not actively be hiring at this point in time, but how do you build a sense of who you are before people come in to start with, right? So that's one part. Then, of course, there's within the hiring sort of cycle, there's, different parts of that. So we looked at that as well as a sort of a system. The third part is, what is daily life like? And that is, of course, the once somebody's in the organization, that's the majority of the way in which they experience the organization. So we looked at multiple touch points within that, right? From the more starting at the beginning, somebody's first 30 days, somebody's first 60 days, 90 days, right? Then what happens when somebody's been there for a year? What happens when somebody's been there for 2 years, right? And there are typical inflection points that everyone goes through. If you're in the tech space today in India, if you're a funded company, then at 3 or 4 years, then there's typically an itch when people's stock options vest, etc. Maybe I don't know what the average lifespan of an employee is today. I suspect that it's somewhere between maybe, I don't know, 18 to 24 months. I think Shipra is probably a better place to answer that. But we said, okay, how do we actually build for one of our primary goals as an organization is to say, how can we build an organization where somebody would want to stay for 10 years, right? How do we make sure that we look at building an ambitious goal, right? Where there's no downside to remaining at Obvious for 10 years, either in terms of your own personal growth, your career growth, the opportunities that you unlock as part of that, or the financial compensation that we can create for you. Right? So that's how we sort of oriented ourselves along this particular thing. And of course, we're nowhere close to that, right? I cannot today in good faith say, hey, if you stay at Obvious for 10 years, you will not have any opportunity costs relative to the larger market, right? But I think that that's the sort of North Star that we're looking at all our recruitment processes, all our, I don't know what it's called. I read employee life cycle, is that right? So, the entire time when somebody is with you. Right? And I think then the last bit is we also very actively sort of look at how do our, when somebody leaves Obvious, and, in many cases, for the most part, right, it's been extremely amicable. We've actually encouraged people to move out because, I think that in many cases, though we saw that, to meet their own personal objectives, they would need a different space. They would need different opportunities. They would need different geographies, right? But we said that how do we maintain a great alumni network, right? Because we don't see that this is sort of a one-way relationship, right? If you look at, for instance, other consulting companies like a McKinsey, for instance, right? Their alumni are their biggest clients, right? Out of I don't know what the numbers are, but if you look at the Fortune 500, I would estimate that a good 50 to 60% of sort of C-level is seeded with by McKinsey, and that becomes a regular stream of business for them. So it creates a sort of a very a virtuous cycle in some sense, right? So we looked at all of these different bits and we said, okay, to start with, let's be very clear even before somebody joins us, because at this point in time, or when I'm talking about 3 years ago, there's no good reason for somebody to, there's no good way for people to find out what Obvious is about. So what we did is we started from this value of being public by default with all the things that we do, right? And we assembled what we today call our playbook, which is at this point in time more than 50,000 words, which is publicly accessible about everything, right? From the mundane to the sublime is how I term it, right? So everything from these are the days that we have holidays. this is what you can expect on your first day, to, we give away all our secret sauce in terms of this is exactly how we do, our design, this is how we do our engineering. We tell people like, our entire hiring exam is available online. So all the questions that we would ask you as part of I think there's sort of, in the engineering hiring, there's a take-home exercise, etc. All the questions are available, and the way in which we would evaluate your submission is also publicly available, right? So you don't have to go through our hiring pipeline to get a sense of what it would be like. You don't have to be part of Obvious to at least get a sense of what it's like internally as well, right? So I think we sort of looked at these as systems and not as, hey, we need to go hire 10 women. And so how can we short circuit that? I can go into more detail perhaps, but I don't want to take up so much airtime.
Right. So I think I just have one last question for both Shipra and Rahul before we run a poll and open it up to the attendees over here, which is that this is again going back to this question, and maybe you have addressed it, but if you could summarize one or two uh, expectations that you have found that women candidates have had, which may have not been part of your messaging, or what you've learned in the process of hiring, like what are your hiring funnels, and what is the expectation of a candidate from the employer, from the workplace, and which you think other organizations should also incorporate when they're reaching out. Shipra and then Rahul. Shipra, you will have to unmute
Yes.
yourself. Yeah.
Yeah. So if I look at the example of how I am staying at Just Pay and what is really motivating me to stay at Just Pay, uh, uh, I just wanted to put across that Just Pay is a place where you are not involved in one particular area. So, for example, let me just take that recent example, and we were doing this closure meetup, right? And you were helping us in, bringing in the community and talking about what we are doing. And suddenly we came up about this mug logo, and we wanted to get the mug logo to you, and it was so urgent, and we were so working out onto that. But my team wasn't there. They were out somewhere, and they were not available to me. My design was like, okay, what I have to do now? So I created the design. I went into it. I created 5 6 designs. I really draw that design onto the mug. And I went to Vimal, the founder of the company, and I say, Vimal, can we just do this? And he sat with us for around 3 to 4 hours, and we just did a lot of improvement into it, and we came up with the design, and we all loved it. So that's how we are bringing the responsibility and the ownership to everyone. It's not even women, but to everyone. And women's are very much interested in all these areas where they can outperform the real responsibilities of theirs, and then they bring more creativity and the innovation to different areas. Not only this, I wanted to add, very recently we have started learning R. So I'm also learning R. The whole team is learning R. Why we are learning R, and what exactly it will help us out in the future. So we are learning R to just bring the deep analysis and automation in the human resource team. We wanted to do the funnel analysis not on Excel. We wanted to bring the automated automation towards it, and that's how we believe that people are learning and bringing their strength to the organization, and that's how we are engaging more and more and motivating people to join us.
Right. Yeah, Rahul, thanks for sharing the link to the playbook. I was just going to suggest that we should also tweet about it. But Siddhant, we've noted your question. We will be talking about the disability sector in a bit.
Zainab, I just wanted to add to your question. You asked what did the women working for you expect? So in at least in our case, from I had like 4 women out of our team. At different points, I had 4 women working, for our team, and most of the time they all wanted flexibility because they were working from home. They wanted flexibility in timing. which was one problem they had with many companies where they worked. Because I asked them, so they said, I can do 2 hours in the morning and 2 hours in the afternoon because I have life in the middle. I have to. My son is coming back from school. I have to make lunch for him, and that was very difficult for many companies to accommodate because they have meetings on at scheduled times, and it's always a problem for many organizations to deal with this kind of flexibility. So because they have this concept of having fixed.
They say
Sorry.
different types of flexibility.
Sorry, what something happened?
Yeah, no problem, Ashok. We are all used to this new way of life. There, you can hear my daughter also talking about tamarind. Okay.
Sorry, that was my talking clock. For some reason, it showed up at that point. It was not my son. It was the talking clock. I just realized. Yeah. So sorry for that. So, that is something that I heard across the board, this wanting flexible timing. And because companies have fixed meetings every day, that fixed schedule does not work for many people. So that is one big thing that at least that's what I heard. And then the second thing is probably training, some kind of online courses, because somebody sitting in Baroda, for them to go to a conference and attend something was a problem. So, giving them access to online training or online courses. There's so many of them around, so that was big for many people. That was, they really appreciated very small things like that. I mean, it doesn't cost much to do those things. So that was appreciated. Yeah.
Thanks, Ashok. I think this is quite concrete. Rahul, anything to add on, exactly these concrete points that Ashok has raised in terms of obvious his experience, or anything that you think are other motivating factors beyond these immediate tangible needs of flexibility and education and training?
Sure. So I think that's a good start. That's a definite a huge plus, right? In terms of having flexible times, etc. I think that there's some things that we've done, and I think these are things that are a sort of a result of some of our learnings over the last few years. So I've also included this link later in the chat. Maybe you can share it with the other participants if you think it's applicable. So for instance, we've learned a lot from, our friends at Nilenso. So they introduced a paid menstrual leave policy, right? So we've adopted that completely for ourselves. And so we have a menstrual leave policy, which is separate from our regular holiday allowance or sick leave, etc. We also have very comprehensive family insurance, which covers not just your spouse but also children, right? The other thing that I think that Ashok touched on is also being very sort of aware of what working hours are like, right? So we have very actively look at ensuring that working hours don't exceed a 40-hour work week. In addition to that, whenever we hold events, right, we make sure that we don't do late evenings. You often have team dinners and outings, which are at times which are very difficult. And these are important, places where people make connections. Often there's, sort of post-work connects across teams that happens at these places. And I think they're highly tied to also progress within the organization at certain scales. So we made sure that we looked at, okay, can we not have them later in the evening? Can we do a breakfast meetup instead, right? Is that is that easier for different people? Again, parental leave. India has a really progressive maternity leave policy, I think, especially compared to lots of other global, other countries in the world. But there's a clear expectation in some sense in the law that the women stay at home and take care of children. So we said that, okay, can we at least do, I think that we offer at this point 12 weeks of paternity leave, of paid paternity leave. with an option to extend beyond that at a slightly reduced salary. Beyond that, I think it's really important to have, and I think this is like, for me, this is like the baseline. You have clear policies on discrimination, sexual harassment. Are these sensitized at regular intervals across the company? In some sense, it's not that hard to be inclusive in India, because the bar is so low that you keep, if you're a company, you would keep hitting your ankles against it, right? So in that sense, in terms of a takeaway, I think there's just very small actionable things that you can do. Beyond that, I think looking at, okay, can you sponsor communities which may be outside or which are adjacent to the things that you're doing. So I think that we've worked with you before on this. We work with other groups. There's this one called Pie Ladies. We also actively mentor people without an expectation that they become part of our organization, right? Again, I think that I saw something about physical infrastructure as well, and I think that these are really important things. So continuing from that point about menstrual leave, the core thought was, how do you destigmatize menstruation, right? And so something as simple as making sure that all bathrooms have access to menstrual supplies which are regularly refreshed, right? Is just, and you just put a little sign there saying free for all kind of thing. How do you make sure that your office furniture is suitable for everybody, right? Regardless of your shape and size. Can you have equipment that adjusts to you rather than you needing to adjust to the equipment? So can your desk be lower if you want that? Why does it all have to be at 30 inches is its standard? Why can't it be at 26 inches or 48, right? Depending on what you want. Again, something as simple, and this is something that so many people have called out, that centralized air conditioning is very rarely comfortable for everybody. And I did a little bit of digging into this, and it's really funny. It was sort of standardized based on this study which was done in the 60s, based on the temperature of a white man who's wearing a suit, right? So that's why you'll find that a lot of offices will have the air conditioning down at 22 or something. And this is just such a simple visual test that you can do. You walk into any organization, like a medium-sized company, right? 250 odd company, and just look at who's wearing a jacket or a sweater and who isn't. And there's so much truth in that simple visual test. Right? So yeah, these are just some very basic things that you can look at in terms of changing things around.
Thanks, Rahul, Ashok, thanks for this impetus. What I'm going to do now is, Amok, can we run the first poll? We want to find out from the 12 attendees on Zoom, how many of you are remote workers. So if you could please respond to this one. Okay. I'm going to bring in a few participants over here to respond to some of the points that three of you have made. Let me bring in Nadika, who's my colleague also here. Deepthi, I'm going to promote you also to a panelist so that you can unmute yourself. And we also have Sriraman, who is driving the efforts at Nilenso in terms of diversity. I will point out to you exactly what you need to do. But I also wanted to mention that we have Siddhant and Satish here who represent accessibility and disability. I'm sorry if I've used the wrong terms, but I think they may also have a bunch of questions, both from the point of view of inclusion and from the point of remote work. So we will bring you in as well. But I think in terms of the expectations from Nadika, Deepthi and Srihari, if you all can go one by one in that order, is if you can feedback, the points that Rahul and Chipra made with respect to what would be your expectations as candidates in terms of the kind of organizations they're running, in terms of the messaging that they put out, and what is your expectation as a candidate from the workplace, from the employer, etc., both from the point of view of remote work as well as from the point of view of inclusion. Sorry for the long-winded question, but I think you can take it up from there. So if we can have Nadika, then Deepthi and Srihari.
Okay, so I think very interesting questions and interesting things have come up. So just to give a sort of a background, I've been working on and off outside of an office setup for, I think, well on 10 years now, right? I occasionally go into an office and then I decide that it's too much for me, and then I come out and I start doing stuff on my own, or I work with a few people that I like and sort of do things like that. I think one of the biggest my learnings, I've worked in advertising, I've worked in journalism, TV production, web and tech media and things like that, right? One of the biggest things that I see is that offices sort of companies and organizations and office, that physical space of an office sort of restricts you to conform to certain kinds of expressions on yourself, right? And it also affects you because some of us have complex lives and some of us have complex identities and things like that. So an office space, the physical space, I'm not talking about an organization, but I'm talking of a physical space, sort of restricts how and what you do with yourself. And I think that's something that I would expect from an organization to address to me. If I am, as a candidate, I'm coming to you, how do you address this question of, so there are things like dress code. It may not work for everybody. Some of us don't like dress codes. Some of us, we may have other reasons for letting our hair grow out or whatever, things like that. I'm just saying, this may sound like trivial things to a person from a HR perspective, but for a person who may not be from your mainstream or who don't want to fit into a mainstream, these are things that matter a lot more, right? Things like, for instance, Ashok was talking about, I may have to work, I may be able to work only for 2 hours in the morning and then go and cook and, clean the house and handle things. And maybe I have to go to a bank, for instance, to open an account or to pay off a check or something like that. And if I'm sitting in an office from 9 to 6, then I'm pretty much left hanging with other things that I may have to do. So these are things that I would, things that are matter to me as a candidate.
Cool. Yeah. Thanks, Nadika. Shipra, Rahul, Ashok, can we collect a question from Deepthi, or would you like to respond to this?
I would like to put forward that see, companies, whenever they bring in certain kind of infrastructure, they always bring that infrastructure after understanding the comfortability and of the people. So, for example, when we brought into we recently moved last year, we moved to a different and a new building altogether. But while we were looking at the infrastructure part of it, most of the core team members were playing a really they were playing a really good part in portraying what could be the best comfortable zone and what all things we can bring in to make it more easy way of working, right? So we brought the colors, we brought a very neutral color to the walls of the organization. We brought certain areas where we can put across the way where people go and just have some rest. The sofas, the chairs, the TVs, everything was planned. So we brought in a lot of core team members to help us to address the comfortability of the organization, and later we brought in the way how we are right now in infrastructure today, I would say. I would also like to say how we have pianos on each floor of our office. We have musical instrument. People are very much into the music, into classical music, into different kind of music, and they go around and then they play. We have a library on each floor. Not only that, we have a terrace garden where sometimes people go and sit and they just talk about things, what are happening in their life, what exactly they wanted to innovate and all that stuff. So we have indoor games, we plan indoor games. There are different things at Just Be. So I think we have brought all of it by just understanding the need and to make it as a second home for people.
Okay, Ashok, Rahul, do you have any
I,
comment?
I have a comment on that,
Yeah, yeah.
So I have an extreme view and I have a moderate view. So let me start with the moderate view. So what what Nadika asked has not really been answered there. So I don't see an answer. I'm hearing pianos put in the office space. I'm hearing other stuff. Most people don't want the piano. Do I want to go to office and play the piano? No, I prefer to do fewer hours in the office and sit at home and do my work, get my bank stuff sorted out, get my food cooked nicely by myself. Have the time to do that rather than ordering some stale food from some startup. I might even catch a pandemic doing that. So I think those pianos and those gizmos, they don't really address. They are just there to decorate the office and create like an environment that, hey, it's fine if you all come to work and spend 12 hours a day here. So we got to build a community. So it's ignoring reality. So now, this pandemic has turned up and it's brought reality home. So I'm sorry, but I don't agree with that view. So I think my more moderate view is that, so my extreme view is there should be laws which force companies in certain sectors to have a certain percentage of jobs completely, remote. There should be laws for that. That is my extreme view. Because unless there are laws, companies will never do it. You had, kids working in carpet factories, which was fine, until there were laws banning that. Otherwise, why would something like that happen until the 80s and 90s? That is how I think of these things. So that's my extreme view. So on the moderate side, I think organizations should be flexible. If somebody is different, they may not feel comfortable. Let's face it, organizations are male centric. Everything is male centric. Talking about Netflix and I don't know, all the conversation is around this, kind of artificiality. Netflix, what TV show did you see? What did you do? It's not about life. So what Nadika asked was, how do I feel comfortable, with who I am and, come to the office and I don't feel I'm in a different place. Nadika is probably most comfortable at home. Let's face it, Nadika feels comfortable working from home. So I don't see that being addressed, so that is just what I noticed, sorry.
Sure.
So yeah.
Yeah, Rahul, I think before you can, sorry, Shipra, Rahul, before you can respond to this, point that Nadika made, and I know that Srihari is also here. We actually have a set of very interesting questions from YouTube, which I wanted to bring in over here, and I would also like to put this question to Nadika and to Nikhil as well, and to Srihari, which is that there are questions about saying that how do you assess self discipline and ownership, and relatedly we have Raga Malika and Rashmi asking, saying that how do you track the presence of employees in the work that they're doing when a large number of people in the organization are working from home. So this question of trust and how do you do self assessment and discipline, I think it'll be nice if Ashok, you could go first, maybe then Nadika and Srihari, and then we could take the rest of the people from both an employer and a candidate perspective. Ashok?
So the first thing is, there's an element of trust there. So when you interview the candidate, you can kind of judge that sometimes by asking them, about past work that they have done and checking up with their references. How did this person work in a remote situation? How did they work? So that's one. So two, even in terms of tracking, it doesn't even have to be something very intrusive. You just need to have a daily update. So it's a fact that you can trust people, but sometimes people also slip. So it's good to be able to keep track of that. So what I used to do was have a Trello page where people assign tasks on a weekly basis. They had, they basically broadly knew what they were doing, what they were going to do, and they would just put an update at the end of the day. And since the work was primarily programming, you could see the output which was being put on Git or whatever. Things were being tested. So it's not very hard to do that. So, and most of the time I found if you hire correctly, if you hire the right people, trust is there. If they are late, they will tell you in advance, not at the last minute, but 2 days before. So there's a strong element of trust there. That is certainly there.
Thanks, Ashok. Nadika, if you can also take that question, and then Srihari.
Okay. Yeah, like Ashok says, the question of trust is important. Who and how. So, frankly, I think we're beyond. I think this is something that I think a lot of companies are now figuring it out. Is that letting people set their own deadlines on work, and then just sort of nudging them along, because I think the older technique of the boss is telling you, okay, this is do it, and do it and get this done, and then we'll go to the next task. Sequential sort of sequential working is sort of giving way to taking up a couple of things that like a basket of related work, and just sort of moving along with it and setting very loose deadlines around it. I think that's sort of working. And I say this because from an advertising background to come to a sort of a general purpose, I don't know what I do exactly, but I see that I work better if I know what. If I know that I like these, sort of I set myself these goals, right? And then I know I can do this, and then I set my own deadline around it, and then I just finish it. It doesn't help when somebody's breathing down my neck and telling me, okay, have you done this? Have you done that? Because, and this is coming back to the earlier point of, there are things that we do outside of work also. And if you're sitting in an office and doing these 10 things sequentially every day, and then our head, your mind space is going towards, oh, I have to do that at home, I have to carry over, I have to sort of solve these other things and all that. So your mind space is going, and so your productivity sort of dips there. So I think giving that trust to your employees, that, okay, these are the tasks that we need to finish within a certain number, a certain amount of time. Can we just go ahead and do it, and then we'll catch up and then have a review or whatever. I think that works. There was a question about, in fact, there was a long time ago, there was this concept of presenteeism. I don't know if that people still, talk about that, because in a setup, in a sort of rigid setup, we're forced to be present at work, even though we may not want to be present at work. When you're not well, for instance, maybe let's say you're coming down with a small cold or a flu, right? And you need to turn to work because there's a presentation or there's a meeting or there's something, and then your contribution to that meeting is maybe like 10% of what is going to happen there, but you were forced to stay there for the rest of the whole thing. And so that's going to dip very badly in terms of what you do in terms of work and things like that. So I think those are things that sort of helps with allowing this kind of freedom to choose timings and choose work pressures and things like that. There was a question about values and how do you ensure that other people have the same values. I think it comes back to that idea of trust, and I think it's this idea of what a company wants to be is translated by who is approaching candidates. For instance, in Ashok or a Shipra or a Rahul, go out and meet people, right? It's sort of, I think there are many ways that it translates, and the sincerity of the people, and people sort of build into it. They buy into this philosophy themselves, I think, and you can't force a certain philosophy on people who don't want it, right? And so I think in a certain way, you sort of hire the kind of people who you think will work for this kind of, to use a slightly abused word, in a vision, right? And so we sort of build into that thing, and it sort of comes to it. And I think just a question of this, then trusting that people and giving them that space to build into it and buy into it, and then move on from there.
Thanks, Nadika. I think Srihari and Rahul and maybe Nikhil, if you could also take this question of like, self-discipline, self-assessment, especially because I think in many of your contexts it's also linked to being able to, deliver to a certain client. In your case, you have to deliver on time. And so therefore, like, what happens in that case? Srihari, are you able to speak?
Sure. Yeah, am I audible?
Yes, pretty much.
Yeah, okay, cool. I missed a good chunk of the...
You can also turn on your video if you like. Otherwise, we are
No,
happy.
I'm in a dimly lit space. Sorry.
Okay, all right, fine, yeah.
Would have been able to do that about an hour ago. So yeah, I think I might have missed some of the context early on. I wasn't able to join this in the initial part. And I also want to call out that at Nilenso, I'm probably not the best person to talk about this because since, well, I'm male, and I think it's a lot more valuable to have a perspective of a woman. And I think, for example, Deepa or Nid, who are in leadership positions, would be in a much better place to talk about this. However, in terms of trust and self-assessment and whatnot, I think one thing that comes somewhat by nature to us is transparency. We are structured as a cooperative, and we have a sense of equal ownership at Nilenso. So this means that irrespective of your gender, irrespective of your seniority, you are going to have an equal sense in ownership in terms of having an equal say. And structurally, that provides transparency in finances, transparency in communication, right? So over time, over years, what this has resulted in is a trust in that if you're going to have a conversation with somebody, you're likely going to have that conversation with other people as well. And there is no difference in you having that conversation one-on-one and having that conversation in a group. All reviews, everything happen publicly. I think that's something that we've grown with, and I think that kind of helps. Not reporting to someone also helps. So we don't really have someone to like, okay, this person is your boss, you need to report to this person. We just expect people to give daily updates on Slack, whoever they are, and they have a Slack channel and whatnot. And it's not really different whether you're male or female, at least in that respect. Like Rahul mentioned earlier, in terms of menstruation and the baggage that comes with it or whatever, right? Like it's completely okay for someone to say, I have cramps, and then take the day off. It's not a sick leave, and people understand what's going on there. And so it's also okay to talk about it completely at all times. Yeah, so structurally, I think that's kind of the space we are in, and I'm guessing it helps, but I haven't really received an outsider's view on this. An example of something that we hadn't thought about a lot, for example, is when one of the people that we work with refused to work in the same room as us because it was a room, and it has walls, and the door could be closed. Right, and we didn't recognize this until it was said. We do our work from a house essentially, right, and not a large building with glass walls all around, and there is a lack of physical transparency. And this is something we hadn't even considered until this person actually told us. And since then, we've made a little bit of an effort in always keeping doors open, even if you're in meetings, things like that. And I'm sure we have a lot to do on that front as well. We have a lot to improve on. And touching back a little bit on the remote aspect of things, I'd say at least at Nilenso and being consulting firm and whatnot, work from home hasn't changed a whole lot. Although I think working from home has helped make some of the things that are generally more prominent with women, as in taking some time off to cook or go to your vessels or whatever, apparent in everyone's lives, right? So it shows up in everyone's, okay, I'm doing this right now, sorry, I'm not in front of your screen, front of the screen, I can't respond to this right now. That sort of thing becomes a little more apparent, and I think maybe we can use that as an input to ensure that we're always being a bit sensitive.
Thanks, Srihari. Rahul, if you can take this question and any comments on Adhika's point. I think there's also a nice point that's been raised in the chat, which is presence Sorry, Satish obviously says no, where the presence is equal to productivity. But I think Rahul, in your case, given that you also have to deliver to clients, how does this play out?
Sure. So I think that, at this point, it's probably useful to distinguish two things, right? Remote work versus working from home, right? They're very different things. And I think that, at this point, we are working from home, but I think remote work specifically is a very different topic, right? Remote work means that as an organization, whatever your organization does, right? I think Shipra's organization is in the business of creating a payments product. Ashok has a legal startup, right? Srihari and I work at consulting companies. Nadika is in, like she said, right, in the media and advertising space, perhaps. Remote work requires that you look at how all of the sort of, if you look at a company as a black box and, inputs being capital, people, etc., and the outputs being the, whatever it is that comes out at the other end. Remote work requires, clear cultural protocols, I would say, almost around how do you be effective, right? And every company will have different answers for that, right? And I think that Ashok highlights some interesting points about requiring a certain, like for instance, legislating that a certain number of people be remote, or a certain percentage, if I remember correctly. I'm actually almost scared of that. Not from the perspective of needing people to be remote, but my experience with companies which have some people working in one location don't have a remote culture, but have some people working from elsewhere. What typically happens in setups like that I've seen are that there's huge information asymmetry, because there's lots of conversations, which, of course, some of them are around, are more socially oriented. So around, what you might be watching, or whether you prefer X versus Y or whatnot. But many of those are around how do we do something, or will pertain to how you produce code or design or any of the varied things that people do in these companies. And so if you don't have a clear way that everybody in your organization, right, whether they're within an office building which has glass walls, which has rooms, or your office building is your Slack channel, or your office building is a distributed company entirely, right? When nobody has to be, say, online at the same time necessarily. You don't have meetings, right? So there are many companies which push that particular perspective very, very far. And I think that we've tried to borrow from those. So I think good places to look at are companies like GitLab. Basecamp is a big proponent of remote work, right? And it's kind of interesting, because if you dial back to the early, I don't know when exactly, but late 90s, early 2000s, there was a clear schism that kind of happened between the idea of agile with a capital A and agile as a discipline with a lowercase a. And so then you went into people becoming agile certified, right? Looking, fast forwarding 2 or 3 years into the future, I for one believe that this pandemic is here to stay, and there will be future similar pandemics. Do we see remote certified companies emerging, right, which have as little relation to productivity in a remote space as some of these predecessing things? So yes, I think that presence is, for us at least, I think with discipline, with a clear understanding of what are all the kinds of artifacts that you're producing, presence does not need to equal productivity. But I do empathize with companies which aren't set up to be productive without presence as well, right? I think that the majority of the tech sector in India at this point in time would not be productive without presence, right? That's the reality of the situation. And of course, legislation is a powerful tool which can attack that. It's also a very blunt instrument. So I think that we have to move in with a cultural approach. For instance, writing needs to be a discipline and be a first-class citizen in a fully remote workplace, right? The understanding of how to be effective asynchronously is probably an equally important discipline. The other thing is that I think there are different kinds of disciplines, some of which are it's sort of to riff off I can't remember whom, I think Thomas Friedman or Friedman. Remote work is here, but it's unequally distributed, right? So there are protocols and ways in which programmers can be extremely effective and have historically been effective remotely. Those protocols do not necessarily exist for all kinds of cultural production, right? So can designers be as effective? Maybe 50% with further investment in best practices, closer to 80 and 100. But for many people, that's not part of the job training, unfortunately. So I think that we need to sort of evolve those practices as we move forward as well.
Correct.
I don't know if I answered the questions at all.
No, I think this was useful, and I think it was a good point about saying that presence is required at some level, but presence is not the only way to be productive. I think some very telling remarks over here. Can I request actually Satish at this point if you can step in, because Satish, you did make this point of saying that presence is not equal to productivity. I know that you work with DQ and you have your own context with respect to accessibility. So if you could quickly comment on this, and then we may have to close, but we do have a bunch of things before we close. So Satish?
Yeah. So what I'm trying to tell here is, for example, our company in US, not in India, obviously, but in US has remote work because accessibility. We are in accessibility space. Our company is DQ Systems Incorporated, which is into accessibility space, digital accessibility space, and most of the work in US is done remotely. And because there is no need of a presence for somebody to sit and do the work. All that you get is a product. You need to just assess them, audit them for accessibility, or sometimes they give you a design files. You need to annotate them with accessibility related feedback and all that. But otherwise, this is absolutely fine for a remote place. So India, we do have office, but at the same time, our company has also provided remote work, or I don't know. So I don't understand the difference between work from home and remote work, but let's say that it is a remote work. Obviously, they don't stay in the same city, obviously. There are a lot of women employees who got married and they wanted to move to their husband's location. So our company did or has provided that opportunity to go and to go to their place and work. And we don't really ask for, when do you log and when do you log out. All that matters is, are you staying for that 8 hours and be productive? It doesn't matter when I ping you, you are present or not. If you're able to come back and answer me, I think that is fine. That's what we count. The only place that so our company just have employees with disabilities, and even I'm one of them. So the only place a remote work or probably a work from whichever it is has a disadvantage for people with uh, so if you have a lot of meetings, particularly people who are visually impaired or blind, what they will face is if there are so much of sharing the screens and explaining the concepts, or maybe some organizational charts, or maybe sometimes the presentations and all that going on, they may find it difficult because obviously there would be no one to help them, whereas in an office space there would be somebody to help them. But if you're on the other hand, this is just a one small glitch that we have at remote work. But if on the other hand, they will be more productive because they are comfortable at where they are. Although they want to venture out, that's a different story. But still at home, they can be comfortable because they know the place. They can roam around, they can go to their systems and work anytime, and they can be productive. So they don't need to travel. They don't need to ask for help in the at the public place, or maybe the commutation and all that. So there are a lot of things that could be saved for people with disabilities, and our company adopts that also. And as of now, so for the past 1 month, I've been doing work from home, and I'm able to meet the same goal as I was able to at office too. Thank you.
Thanks, Satish. Okay, so time is not unfortunately on our side. We are actually at the close, but there are a lot of very good questions, including one that even I'm very interested in. I knowing, which is somebody mentioning that she's the only woman on her team, and there is everyone chasing a deadline, and she seems to be the one at disadvantage. And what role can HR play? Unfortunately, we don't have the time to answer that question and a bunch of other questions that have come regarding mental health. But what we can promise you is that we will rope in the people here on this chat, and hopefully Rahul and Chipra and Ashok will also join us, and we will do a session which might be an AMA where we can look at these questions and some of the follow-up questions that have also come in. Please stay tuned. We will keep you updated in terms of how we're going to run this, but we will try to take this up as soon as possible, since the conversation is quite lively and people have a lot of questions. I don't have anything else much to say over here, but thank you so much, Ashok, Rahul, Shipra, and many of you others. Unfortunately, we could not include all of you given that we had shortage of time, but let's keep continuing this conversation, and let's see if we can actually kind of come up with a framework. And like like Rahul mentioned, obvious as a playbook. I think this might be a useful time for organizations to create some of these blueprints for themselves, either in terms of playbooks or little things that actually help in ingratiating a culture itself. Having said that, thank you very much. We have a Slack channel you can join, which is friends.hasgeek.com. And let's hope to continue the conversations over there, and you will hear from us in terms of follow-up and this and questions to be taken up. Thank you, everyone, for being here today.
Thank you.
Yes.
Bye.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.